I'm excited to be here today because this is a continuation of even more information that I was able to put together and that I wanted to share with you, because it's all a part of the building on this concept of the symbolism that is being used in the Book of Mormon, and especially concerning the serpents and how they relate them to the Mesoamerican snake kings, which is the title of our particular presentation today. So in a previous presentation, I covered the connections between Joseph of Egypt and the Jaredite or Olmec culture of Mesoamerica. In the last presentation, I introduced the connection between the serpents and the Mesoamerican snake kings of the Peten of Guatemala. This theory proposes that the serpent invasion experienced by the Jaredites was actually a hostile immigration of seafarers who were culturally known as serpents. Eventually, a barrier was created and total separation was accomplished. This invasion of serpents begins a 400-year occupation of the land east of the Grijalva River. So what is happening in the Mediterranean region that initiates this migration? In order to get into the flow of information, I'm just doing kind of a quick recap of what we introduced last week. And so here on the graph, you see that at the time of Heth, with the serpent invasion in the land, you have the Santorini eruption that happened in the Mediterranean, and coinciding with that is the exodus of the Israelites out of Egypt, and then 40 years later, you have the Israelites going in and warring and taking over several cities from the Canaanites. So, the serpent invasion is happening at the same time that an explosion of Santorini takes place. This volcanic explosion creates a tsunami that destroyed the Minoan port cities on the north side of the island of Crete. Now, this is, to give you an idea, this is a photograph of the island of Santorini. And this, here in the middle, is the caldera. It was all land above the ocean, and when this island exploded, then it sunk in, and it was filled in with ocean water. Now, since then, there have been several eruptions that have come up, and so you've got these cones that are coming up in the middle of the water. But this is 6 miles wide, and this is 11 miles long. That's a huge amount of material that has got ejected out of that and up into the atmosphere, right? And as was stated before, this is the island of Santorini. You can see the caldera here, and then the tsunami that came down and wiped out all of these port cities along on this north side of Crete, that was the main hub that Manoah was working out of, was out of Crete. This explosion and tsunami is happening at the same time that Egypt is reeling from the plagues, the exodus, and the loss of the worker class, which is followed by the Hebrew invasion of Canaanite cities 40 years later. All of these events are creating huge cultural shifts in the Mediterranean region. This means that the Minoan cultural economic engine is decimated. Something has got to fill the void. The Egyptian culture is experiencing a major restructure, and the Canaanite culture is falling apart. What happens in times of disasters that cause social upheavals? Mass migrations. This leaves the Phoenicians and Mycenaeans as the most capable seafaring cultures in the Mediterranean. These seafarers probably offered to help the refugees, but only to the extent that they agree to relocate them, not take them in. And by the way, if you have to understand, the Minoans were proprietary. On all of the trade routes that they were managing, they were proprietary. And if you weren't one of them, then if they were taking you somewhere, it's a one-way ticket. You're not coming back into the Mediterranean with knowledge of where you went and where their things are located. If you went somewhere, it's a one-way ticket. Within a few years, Egyptian and Canaanite refugees are looking for a place that provides safety for families. Again, the Phoenicians and Mycenaeans are able to provide passage. Hence, the Old Neck region has a very large group of refugees who are looking to start anew. But when these refugees arrive in the New World, there is already a famine in the land. What do a people of desperation do to ensure their survival? They take desperate measures. Perhaps something like stealing herds and taking them to a wilderness area that is defensible. Now, before we go any further, I want to share with you a little information about the Great Destruction that I've come across and new evidences we have found concerning how the narrow neck of land was impacted by this event recorded in the Book of Mormon. So this is how the Grijalva River looks today, how it flows today. But notice how the modern-day Tonalá River flows in almost a straight line with the Grijalva right here. We're going to take a quick look at the things we've discovered over the last couple of years. And I've created an inset here on Google Earth, Google Maps, and we'll take a look at what's happening. First off, this is where the Grijalva flows down, and it comes to a point here, and then it just makes a right turn. It's flowing to the northwest, and then it makes a right turn, and it goes up to the northeast. And it actually, today, it marries up with the Usinacenta River right before it goes out to the mouth of the Usinacenta into the Gulf of America. I'm going to show you a couple of things here that are important. This is El Chichonal, or El Chichon. Many of you may remember that in 1982, El Chichon had a major eruption, and it killed some people in villages around, and then it threw ash all over in the Tabasco region. Cardenas was impacted by that. Neil was living in Cardenas and was very aware of what was going on. What we discovered, we had been looking at the possibility of the Great Destruction being a volcano of some form, because they talk about fire coming out of the sky and burning up Zarahemla and things like that. And so we dropped in at a university at Tuxtla Gutierrez and came across a guy in the science department who was a volcanologist. And we engaged with him, and he took us to a confirmation that in the 1st century AD, so somewhere between 0 and 100 AD, there was a major eruption at El Chichon. Why did he know that? Because of the ice cores, the Greenland ice cores. They found material from El Chichon in the ice fields up there. So the ejection of material out of here was large enough that it carried that far and even went northward towards Greenland and deposited there. So somewhere in that region, in that time frame, was a major eruption here. Now, 25 miles west of there is a land feature called La Candelaria. And before I show you what that looks like, I want to remind you from the Book of Mormon something about the Great Destruction. This is from the 4th chapter of the 3rd book of Nephi. And thus the face of the whole earth became deformed because of the tempest and the thunderings and the lightnings and the quaking of the earth. And behold, the rocks were rent in twain. Yea, they were broken up upon the face of the whole earth, insomuch that they were found in broken fragments and in seams and in cracks upon all the face of the land. And it came to pass that when the thunderings and lightnings and storm and tempest and the quakings of the earth did cease, for behold, they did last for about the space of 3 hours, and it was said by some that the time was greater. Nevertheless, all these great and terrible things were done in about the space of 3 hours, and then behold, there was darkness upon the face of the land. Now, I want you to think about reports of earthquakes that happen today. They last for maybe 3 minutes, 4 minutes, right? Not something that goes on for 3 hours. This is a huge event that I would dare say most of us would have the ability to comprehend how massive it is. But again, La Candelaria, here is where the river makes a right turn and goes in between these two. This is what it looks like. This is a fairly new geological feature, and we know that because of the hard, sharp ridges that are all around. Anything that's been around for ages rounds off because of wind erosion and water erosion. The Ozark Mountains are fairly rounded versus the Grand Tetons. The Grand Tetons are a new geological feature versus what we find over in southern Missouri, northern Arkansas. But this goes up about 3,000 feet. And what you're looking at is basically something where it's broken, and then there's movement by one side that's pushing that broken, fractured piece up into the air. So that's located right in between El Chichon and La Candelaria. And what I'm getting at is, what I'm showing you is the probability that we had a huge event that's happening over here that disrupted El Chichon enough. And by the way, this is a caldera lake type volcano. So that if you disrupt the surface and that opens up beneath the lake, all that water is going down into the magma chamber, and you have a huge explosion that comes out of that. What we've come to realize is this whole region in here has been lifted up. And in essence, it broke the Grijalva River into 2 rivers and redirected the flow of the upper part and sending it off the other way. So before 34 AD, this is what it looked like. And then right in here you have the movement of the tectonic plates. This is up here is the North American plate. This over in here is the Caribbean plate. This is the Cocos plate. And the Cocos plate, the North American plate is basically fixed. The Cocos plate is in a subduction zone, and it's being pushed underneath the North American plate, okay? So again, this is before 34 AD. This is how it would have looked afterwards. Now, here's more evidence. I've taken that same Grijalva River and overlaid it on this map. Take a look here at all of the old Olmec cities. First off, Levant is about 9 miles off the Gulf of America. And I believe originally Levant was a port city. Also, San Lorenzo factors major into this time frame of around Lib. It's about 25, 30 miles inland. All of this region in here is less than 100 feet above sea level. So I believe that the original coastline was here. And what that does is that means that this narrow neck of land, which is right now 120 miles, was actually less, like 90 miles. So when the Book of Mormon tells us that it's a 1.5-day journey for a Nephite on the line between Bountiful and Desolation, 90 miles or less is something that may be doable for a Nephite to make that journey. And we don't know how much this may have been raised as well. So, in 3rd Book of Nephi also, the 4th chapter, but behold, there was a more great and terrible destruction in the land northward. For behold, the whole face of the land was changed because of the tempests, and the whirlwinds, and the thunderings, and lightnings, and the exceeding great quaking of the whole earth. So they're telling us it's something huge. Just this week, I came across this article. And in this article, they're talking about the very unique dynamics of these 3 tectonic plates and how they work together. And they've run a lot of cores down and soundings down through the surface of the earth, running in a line from the Pacific Ocean up through Mexico City. And what they have found is, from the soundings that they're doing, is that a typical subduction zone, the Cocos Plate here, North American Plate here, they typically tail down like this. Not the Cocos Plate. It actually lays flat against this, which means it has the tendency to not just go down and to crunch, but to also lift. All the way up to Mexico City. It goes all the way up to Mexico City before it starts to tail off underneath. Okay? So, what that means is, at least, now our people who are writing this are down here on the Usima Center, and they're talking about the land northward was where they had exceeding destruction because of the quakings. So, we believe that this area especially is affected. We can see this from where that coastline probably was and the redirection of the Grijalva. But he may be talking about this entire region over here. I don't know if any of you have ever driven up through these mountainous regions, but it looks to me like it could be new. The way that they're so sheer and they're not rounded off. So,
David, you can also see the rock seams that bend back on top of themselves.
Yes.
Everything down through there is all shattered also.
It's all what?
Shattered.
Shattered,
It's
yes.
all loose.
Yes. And so he's talking about how it's broken up. And you can see the seams and the fractures and everything. So we're on to something, I think, guys. This area had a crunch, basically, and a lift at the same time. And that's part of the Great Destruction. But I believe the Grijalva River redirection is also part of the Great Destruction. Now, so getting back to our serpent invasion of the land southward, notice how everything east of the Grijalva River is not considered to be populated by the Olmec. Nothing on the east of this river system interferes with the Olmec trade system. Everything east of the river system is the classic Maya region that we believe to be the Nephites and Mulekites, but they have not yet arrived. Here we are at about the 1400 BC time frame. Nephites and Mulekites don't arrive for another 800 years. So what are the serpents doing in this wilderness area during this 400-year occupation of the land east of the Grijalva River? Is there something happening in the Mediterranean region during this 400-year period? Might there be a connection? And it is during this time, from 1400 to 1000 BC, when the Mediterranean cultures were experiencing a series of invasions from a confederacy of naval raiders called the Sea People. Most of those incursions occurred around the 1200 BC time frame. If the 1447 natural disasters that occurred in the Near East disrupted the seafaring powers, and the Phoenicians and the Mycenaeans took control of the Minoan trade routes, there is still an entire North Atlantic portion of the supply chain whose interests may not be met by the new seafaring powers. Is it possible that the 15th century BC Mediterranean refugees became the group known as the Sea People, who then decide to reclaim their maritime power by invading the Mediterranean port cultures during this time? And are they using their Mesoamerican occupation of the land southward as a base of operational support for the Sea People, who are attempting to reclaim their participation in the global seafaring markets? Don't have any evidence for that yet, but it's a question that I think may lead to other research that we may find. In essence, the sea people were attempting to flex their muscle and became the tail wagging the dog in an attempt to reclaim their portion of the sea trade industry. Ultimately, they were unsuccessful because the power void was already filled by the Mycenaeans and the Phoenicians. It is not until the time of King Lib at about 1000 BC that we find another entry concerning cultural events which imply substantial trade. Here we find that Lib reclaims the land southward with its access to the wilderness, where they are able to find wildlife for sustenance. This is because the serpents have been destroyed. And here's how we find that passage in the Book of Ether. It came to pass that Lib also did that which was good in the sight of the Lord, and in the days of Lib the poisonous serpents were destroyed. Wherefore they did go into the land southward to hunt food for the people of the land, for the land was covered with animals of the forest. And Lib also himself became a great hunter, and they built a great city by the narrow neck of land, by the place where the sea divides the land. And they did preserve the land southward for a wilderness to get game. And the whole face of the land northward was covered with inhabitants. And they were exceeding industrious. And they did buy and sell and traffic with one another, that they might get gain. And they did work in all manner of ore, and they did make gold and silver and iron and brass and all manner of metals. And they did dig it out of the earth, wherefore they did cast up mighty heaps of earth to get ore, gold and silver and iron and copper. And they did work all manner of fine work. And they did have silks and fine twined linen, and they did work all manner of cloth, that they might clothe themselves from their nakedness. And they did make all manner of tools to till the earth, both to plow and to sow, to reap and to hoe, and also to thrash. And they did make all manner of tools with which they did work their beasts. And they did make all manner of weapons of war. And they did work all manner of work of exceeding curious workmanship. And never could be a people more blessed than were they, and more prospered by the hand of the Lord. And they were in a land that was choice above all other lands, for the Lord had spoken it. Now, it states that the poisonous serpents were destroyed in the days of Lib. That could happen several ways. Lib could have been the catalyst to their destruction by the means of war, or commerce, or through the sharing of the gospel. Or it may mean that the bulk of the infrastructure for the serpent culture had already relocated, leaving only a few strays for Lib to remove. Another possibility is that Lib pushed a treaty with the serpents. Lib's time frame is concurrent with the building of King Solomon's temple. The Jaredites list a host of items that would have been important to building the temple, such as gold, silver, iron, copper, brass, and all manner of metals. So the question arises, did the Jaredites enter into a business deal with the serpents to ensure that the Americas could jointly provide enough raw material and labor to fill the demand coming out of the Mediterranean? What if the Jaredites provided the metals and the serpents provided the flax and silk products? What's interesting to note is that it's about 1000 BC when the archaeological record begins to find a ruling class called Snake Kings in the Peten of Guatemala. They are the earliest Maya. This is the emblem glyph for Calakmul, which is one of the primary power centers for the Snake Kings, and you can see clearly the serpent head. That is the main element of that glyph. Archaeologists state that these people are industrial merchants who wield their power through the means of waterway trade, both tributary and oceanic. So, if these are the once poisonous serpents that were the 15th century refugees, then it appears that their maritime identity had morphed from seafaring to being suppliers for maritime trade. Therefore, they moved to areas that were more conducive to oceanic trade of commodities, but they still identified as serpents because it was their cultural heritage. They were first seafarers. The level plains east of the Usinacenta River and the two natural bays on either side at the base of the Yucatan provides a river system network for moving products from inland sources of the Peten to then to the oceanic ports on either side for whatever trade that they were pushing out of the area. But these are the earliest Snake King cities that they're aware of. And this is the high point between the two bays. And there are river systems that come out of here and flow to the bays. There are no river systems in the upper portion of the Yucatan. The only water that they get up there is out of cenotes. Okay? And in the centuries following 1000 BC, the Snake Kings developed the southern Yucatan region between the bays into an industrial-size operation. Large green fields are engineered around each bay to raise produce and tobacco for commercial trade operations. This is how those green areas appear today. Researchers have determined that these fields were worked anciently as raised beds with irrigation in between for uniform growth on an industrial scale. This produce would then be harvested on small barges and taken to larger rivers that would then empty into one of the two bays for distribution to a wider market. But you can see the crisscross network in here that is where they built that for irrigation. And it's kind of uniform throughout that access to water supply. Whatever the motivation may have been for the snake culture to move, it appears that it was during Liv's reign that they vacated the area between the Usinacenta and the Grijalva rivers and concentrated eastward in the Peten of Guatemala and southern portions of the Yucatan. What is interesting about the record of Ether is that the only mention of tensions with outside cultural forces is the story concerning the serpents. All other wars provided in the Jaredite record are internal ones between the family members of the ruling class. And that started early on and went on for about the entire 1800 years with just breaks in between. Does this imply that after the time of Liv, there were good relations with the Snake Kings in the southern Yucatan and the Peten of Guatemala? Does Monument 19 from Levant provide us with a clue that the Jaredites and the Snake Kings united in an agreement of peace to provide products delivered by seafarers? I'm going to show you Monument 19 in a minute, but it was found at Levant. This is Monument 19 at Levant. Neil Stevie did an in-depth analysis on this particular carving, and it was presented at the Book of Mormon Roundtable in November of 2021. But because of the insights that we have received on this serpent, Snake King information, we are taking a different take on it. First thing to note is that we have here three primary images. The first is the image that cradles the entire carving. It's a serpent that wraps around completely. And then you have the man who's seated in the midst of that, and the box elevated above the man with two quetzal birds covering it. First, let's take a look at the serpent. This monument is officially dated to about 900 BC, which is immediately following King Liv, who also built the city of Levant once the serpents were destroyed from the land southward. This particular serpent has often been identified as a feathered serpent. I assume it's because of the feather feature here on the top of the head, because there's nothing on the body that indicates that there are feathers on the body, not like we find on other feathered serpents. But now that we understand that the use of the serpent represents a seafaring people as opposed to a religious belief system, I interpret this span on the head of the serpent as a cultural identifier, specifically Mycenaean. This above image is from a 600 BC vase, and it illustrates the fan feature on the helmets of the Mycenaean soldiers. Therefore, we're making the rational assumption that their ethnicity of origin is Greek, and specifically Mycenaean. It's letting us know that the seafarers, people doing business in the Mesoamerican region, are early Greek mariners, and at about 900 BC, that would be Mycenae. If we follow the shape of the serpent and then place it on our map, we note that there's a faint resemblance in the shape of the serpent and the coastline of the Gulf of America. So is it letting us know that this monument is referencing the seafaring along the coasts of the Gulf of America? You see what I'm getting at here, where you've got this U-shape coming around on the serpent? That's the same U-shape this would be the Olmec region down to about the narrow neck of land, and then from there on would be another culture of some form. Now, let's take a look at the person in the carving.
Yeah.
He's seated in an interesting position as if he might be in a watercraft with a rudder. It looks like a rudder handle in his left hand. Also notice that his feet are resting on the edge of something, but most notably, they are not on the ground. Therefore, this helps validate that his means of propulsion is not his feet or legs, but is in fact a watercraft. And in his right hand is what has previously been identified as a sounding weight, which is similar to what they used to use to test the depth of waters. And that would be consistent with the interpretation of it being a watercraft. However, I believe it is supposed to be a purse to indicate they are in commercial interaction with one another for the purpose of monetary gain. And the interesting part is that same feature of that purse is found all throughout Mesopotamia. They're in carvings all over the place in Mesopotamia. And they refer to it as a purse there. And one other thing to note, his left hand is actually a right hand on, his left hand is actually a right hand on the left arm. It is a reversed hand, which means repentance. He wants to undo an action he had previously done. Through the details of this carving, we can now understand that the serpents who had previously been adversarial to the Jaredites reversed their stance and now desired to enter into commercial trade agreement with the Jaredites. And if we use the scale given to us where the body of the commercial king is overlapping the coastline, in other words, from about here to here and here to here, so where his body is overlapping this coastline area on these two areas here, we take those and we place them on the map. This is what it's indicating, those areas. And because the direction of that the king is facing, it looks like it's coming out of Campeche. So it's coming, you see how he's facing this way? He's bringing commerce to this area, going towards his feet. And so he's facing, it looks like it's Campeche that's dealing trade with the Veracruz area. So now let's take a look at the third aspect of the carving. It is the box covered with 2 X's and 2 Quetzal birds. And several stelae throughout the Mesoamerican region, a square refers to a geographic land. A square is a plane with 2 axes, length and width. This same shape implies the 4 directions of a physical plane we walk through every day. In other words, north, east, south, and west. So it's a geographical land, 2-dimensional. It's the land we walk through. Okay? The use of the Quetzal bird, the use of the X refers to a sacred bond or an act of sanctification. And you find up here that associated with each of these Quetzal birds is an X, which indicates a sacred bond or something that's been sanctified. And the use of the Quetzal birds is interesting here because I don't know that the Olmec used the Quetzal symbol in the same manner as the Maya. From other Maya Quetzal usages, we know they are referring to spiritual and religious concepts. The use of the Quetzal birds with the X indicates or lends itself to a spiritual, that kind of spiritual interpretation as well. It seems that we are being told that they shared mutual spiritual values to gain peace throughout the land, and as a result, the Serpents repented and entered into agreement for seafaring trade with the Jaredites. So this would indicate then that the geography has reached a shared value of some form. That may be an indication, because we're talking a Quetzal bird here. It may be an indication they shared the gospel and it was received. And so these people repented and entered into commerce with the Jaredites. Now this all makes sense. However, I'm inclined to believe that this particular carving is a Maya carving referencing an Olmec historical event. We already have the ambassador stone at Levant, which tells the Captain Moroni cult of freedom, but it had always been assumed that this was the only Maya addition to the corpus of Olmec carvings found at Levant. This particular one, it shows Captain Moroni. He's holding a banner, and it's for God, family, and freedom. So because of the clean lines of this particular carving, the same way that we saw the clean lines on the ambassador stone, and the usages of the symbols that they used, I'm inclined to believe that this was not carved at 900 BC, but it was a Golden Age carving done by the Bountiful Historical Society. So I just want to bring home the point that the monument we just viewed is from Levant, which we believe is the city of desolation. It's the only classic Olmec city in the former Serpent territory, and it would have been a border town between the two cultures. Consider this possibility, that the Jaredites and the Snake Kings created a co-op in the production and shipping of commodities, so much so that after 1000 BC, the ruling families began to intermarry in the same way that the Lamanites did with the Jaredites shortly after they gained power in the southern Mayan highlands. Did this intermarriage of families eventually lead to the final wars among the Jaredites? Is this why the epic final battles took place between the plains of Levant, which is the city of desolation, and the hill Ramah, which is Cumorah? So, I'm going to show you here, the city of Nephi is located right here. This is why we identify Levant as the city of desolation. The city of Nephi is up here. Limhi says, he's sending out a party of people, and he says, go find Zarahemla. Well, from this region, they had two choices. They could go over a mountain range and hit the La Condone, which would take them down and take them on the Yosemite River. Or they could go to the west and hit the Grijalva and take it down. They did not take the Yosemite route. They went down the Grijalva, and this in the land of desolation is where they found the bones, the breastplates, the swords with the hilts rusted on them, and the 24 plates of ether. And from all the other battles and descriptions that we have about the city of desolation and land of desolation, it fits this particular geography here. As you know, in the city of Nephi, it's Ammon that comes up later, and he says, hey, I came from Zarahemla, I can take you back here. This is how we sneak out of the city, and then they come and they go down and become part of Zarahemla. But In the final battles of the Jaredites, and this, by the way, is beginning around 300 BC and working down to probably around 275 or so. But there's a series of battles. You read through and it's battle after battle after battle between Coriander and Shiz, right? And they keep talking about going west, and then they come back east on several places. Where that final beheading and final battle took, that final battle took place, I'm not yet set on where that may be located. I do believe Cumorah was one of the very last, but not necessarily the final battle where Shiz was beheaded by Coriander. But it's somewhere in this region here between those two. So does this imply that eventually the Snake Kings expanded their operations by pushing everything westward, and their commercial interests took control of the entire Gulf of America shoreline, so they could control all merchant transactions once the Olmec royalty had been eliminated? So here they're working this entire region, they're making their way across over to Levant, and that's later we'll see that becomes the land bountiful. But then once the Olmec or the Jaredites have destroyed one another as far as a royal government and representative cultural government, I believe they move right on in and take over all of that commercial industry going along there. Does this imply that the Snake Kings became the Book of Mormon land bountiful? Was it called bountiful because of the amount of industry it generated? They were an industrial machine, and they were trading with the Mediterranean on a grand scale. The bountiful region is mentioned in the dialogue of the Book of Mormon as if it is part of the Nephite holdings, but in fact, we receive no details about governmental dealings within Bountiful. Bountiful never factors heavily in the narrative until the Moroni Wars and Christ's visitation after the Great Destruction. Do we get the sense that Bountiful and Zarahemla are always in good graces because the Snake Kings, Bountiful, entered into a contract and granted the land rights to the Mulekites, who possessed a royal blood connection with the Jewish throne? Let's review the regional history to see if these concepts make sense. This is a map system that I have put together as we've already presented. It appears that about 1650 BC, the Minoans make contact with the Jaredites, and then 37 years of reign, the Jaredites are providing Egypt with grains, fruits, and animals that are useful for the food of man. The area in brown appears to be the regions that are developed by the Jaredites to support this high demand for exports to the Mediterranean region. So you see here, they're all the way up, even above the, trying to think of what's the Poza Rica area, Tampico up here, all the way down to Levant, and then all the way on the Pacific coast across into El Salvador, all the way into Honduras, southern Guatemala. These are all the Pacific coast slope and the highlands. Okay? Then at 1400 BC, about 200 years later, during the reign of Heth, when the culture had been completely turned away from God and they were about to be removed by means of famine, that there is an invasion of the serpent culture seafarers who chased the herds to the land southward and put up a hedge to keep the Jaredites pinned in their present location. So that's what we have here between the Grijalva and Yosemite rivers, all the way down here then. And I don't know how much of this they were actually inhabiting. They might have been concentrating in the lowland because they were seafarers. They lacked coastal access. It is during the time of Lib at about 1000 BC when we see the development of the Snake Kings in the Peten of Guatemala and in the southern portion of the Yucatan. It infers that the Serpents moved their operations from 200 miles of coastline bordering with the Jaredites to a region of over 1,000 miles of coastline, 2 natural bays, and small rivers to convey product into the bays. Both of these regions had industrialized and apparently entered into a trade agreement. 400 years later, at 600 BC, the Lehigh group leaves out of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula at a region called Salalah. And they land on the Pacific coast of Guatemala, travel up the Sumala River to Lake Atitlan, where they begin settling at a location on the lake that today is called Solala. Did you catch all those cognate names in there? Salalah is where the port area where they left out of in Saudi Arabia Peninsula. They went up the Sumala River, and their first city or area that was built up, that was settled there, is Solala. They have passed through the coastline trade routes of the Jaredites and have settled in the mountainous highland regions that are somewhat hidden from the Pacific slope. In other words, you have to go over a pretty hefty set of mountain in order to get into that Lake Atitlan area. It's not easy access from the Pacific side. Then, 14 years later, the Mulekites travel by means of Phoenician shipping routes to the Gulf of Campeche, where they travel up the Usinacenta River and begin settling at Yaxchilán, which is the city of Zarahemla. So they're coming up the Usinacenta here, and now they're beginning to develop into the interior of that river system. Why do we make the solemn claim that the Mulekites were located on the Usinacenta River system? It's because we have evidence. This is called the unfinished stela, and it is found in Frontera at the mouth of Usinacenta River. It provides us with several clues about the 586 migration. First off, the hat is in the shape of a top-down view of a 2-masted Phoenician ship. What you see here are the 2 masts. These are oar bays on each side. These are oars coming out the top. This is a rudder coming out the back. Here's this is the bow, this is the stern. And then you have the covers on the product bay, or the holds, basically, of the ship. So the hat that he's wearing, which indicates knowledge of, because it's on the head, so this person has knowledge of the Phoenician trade that's going on, and that's what has brought them here. He wears clothing similar to Hebrew priests, with a prayer shawl, an incense bag, and prayer phylacteries on the wrist. So here's the prayer shawl, here's the copal bag, here's the prayer phylacteries on the wrist. His earplug contains the seal of Solomon floating on the water with rope bordered around it. So here's the seal of Solomon. It's a 6-pointed star that's interlaced. Here's waves of water, and then here's the rope border that goes around. And the glyph blocks had no writing in them because the Mulekites had no sacred writing of their cultural heritage. It's one of the reasons they lit up when Mosiah showed up with the records, the brass plates, and the records that they were keeping. Because, and their language had been corrupted because they had no writing. Remember that? This stela and its placement at the mouth of the Usinacenta River is a bountiful historical marker that provides us the critical clue that the Mulekite story will be found on this river. It also infers that the Usinacenta River system had not yet been industrialized, and further implies that the Snake Kings were willing to allow the Mulekites into the interior of the region for that very purpose, to develop it, to industrialize it. Both the Mulekites and the Snake Kings were benefiting from this new relationship. The Mulekites were being protected in the deep interior of the Mesoamerican region so that enemies of the Jewish throne would have had a hard time finding them. And that's an important thing, because remember what Nebuchadnezzar did to Zedekiah and all of his sons, right? And the Snake Kings would finally develop the Yosemite River system interior. This implies that the Mulekite migration was not isolated nor homogeneous. The Mulekites assimilated into an industrial culture that already existed at least 400 years prior to their arrival. The only reason the Mulekites had passage to the Americas is because there was already substantial Phoenician trade taking place between the Mediterranean and the Americas. Apparently, the Mulekites provided the Snake Kings an opportunity to expand their industry into regions further south up the Yosemite River, and it appears that the Jewish royal connection with the Mediterranean provided the Mulekites with cultural influence that translated into social status. Similarly, the Lehi migration assimilated into a region that was a Jaredite trade route. It is speculated that Lehi was a merchant and that he was very successful at it. This being the case, and Laman and Lemuel being driven to seek after riches, it made them perfect candidates to practice and excel at merchandising. If so, then it explains the rise of power of the Lamanite trade in the Mayan highlands. They are increasing in status and influence while the Jaredite culture falls into decline and eventually governmental chaos. In order to progress in the rise to power, Laman conspires to kill Nephi and his followers because it is easier to engage in ruthless practices and take over an already established trade system if you can suppress your conscience. And Laman and Lemuel's conscience was Nephi. So, get rid of that guy. This results in a split that places the Nephites in the northern Mayan highlands. So, at 500 BC, what we find is the Lamanites have moved out of Sololal. They're now over in Kaminalhuyu. The 500 to 450 BC time frame is when things begin to really explode in the Kaminalhuyu region. And it becomes kind of a southern hub of trade activity with Honduras, with El Salvador, and then with islands coming down from Teotihuacan. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned earlier, there's now going to be intermarrying that goes on with Teotihuacan. And Kaminalhuyu is developing and flourishing in production and trade. Okay? But then you have the Mulekites who have the interior. They're developing the San Pedro River, Usumacinta, the Passion River, the Salinas, the Lacandon. They're moving all throughout here and beginning to develop a trade system of their own. The Nephites went northward. And I believe they started out at the Chichicastenango and Huehuetenango area, and eventually, over the next period of time, they keep getting pushed northward by the Lamanites. So that by 300 BC, the Jaredites are engaged in the final battles between the royal families who are wanting complete control. They've already lost the Pacific corridor south of the Isthmus of Tehuantepec. The Lamanites are now in control. So they're engaged in all their battles and their warring. In the meantime, the Lamanites fill the void, the power void. They take everything along this area, the southern trade routes that were used originally by the Olmec. The Nephites are being pinched in on the northern highlands as the Lamanites continue to move northward, and the Mulekites have expanded all the way throughout the Yosemite River system, even reaching to the Caribbean coast. It is at about the 2025 BC time frame when Nephi and his followers leave the city of Nephi and in the highlands and eventually find the city of Zarahemla. So eventually, they're in the very northern part here, and they make their way down, and they find Zarahemla and begin to assimilate there. So that by 90 BC, the sons of Mosiah are heading south to preach to the Lamanites. The government of the Jaredite culture is destroyed, and the regions have become city-states with no identifiable unity at all. So it just becomes, in the Nephite record that we have, the Book of Mormon, it just becomes a land northward. That's all it is. It's the land northward. It's not a particular people or entity that's being identified. And the Nephite culture is struggling with assimilating into the Mulekite culture, but their influence reaches all the way from the sea east to the borders of the sea west, and they are bordered by Bountiful on the north and the wilderness on the south, which is inhabited by the Lamanites, we're told. So that by 60 BC, 7 of the 10 Lamanite cities have been converted, and a substantial portion of them have moved from the highlands into Jershon in the land of Zarahemla, which is the northeastern Peten and northern part of the country of Belize. We'll take a look in a minute. At this time, the Nephites are engaged in the Moroni Wars, which is the bulk of the latter chapters of the Book of Alma. But because of the Moroni Wars, we're able to identify all these areas within the land of Zarahemla. You know, Jershon, Antionum, Gideon, Minon, Manti, Nephi, Ammonihah, Melech. And we have cities that we've identified that go with those lands. And then eventually, after the great sign in the heavens, a lot of these lands break up. There's no more unity of the Nephite government, right? These are the time of the Gadian robbers. This is when everybody gathers together and fends them off for a period of time. But all of this provides us with an understanding of why the Nephite intrusion into the Mulekite culture was met with so much resistance. While the Mulekite kings may have understood the prophetic implications of reuniting the northern and southern king lines to the Israelite throne, this fact was of no value to those who were not Hebrew. When the Nephites merged into the Mulekite kingdom with their emphasis on spirituality, it changed the dynamics of decision-making and disrupted the status quo in the halls of industry. Alma's visit to Antionum and the conversion of the Zoramites is a perfect illustration of this. Malachiah, in his stratagem to change the Nephite government back to kingship and then to later become the Lamanite king, the resistance of the kingmen, the constant efforts to kill the sitting chief judge and install a ruler in his place, all of it is the effort to remove individual freedom and place the government under the decision-making of a few special interests that benefited the large industrial stakeholders. It is in this cultural dynamic that Captain Moroni's banner of freedom becomes very important. It is the classic battle between individual freedom to answer directly to God or submit to governmental overreach that becomes, at the least, financial slavery, if not literal slavery. All of this implies that the bulk of the societal influence in Mesoamerica is not Hebrew. The theology and cosmology are clearly Judeo-Christian, but this is only because we are looking at their culture through the lens of the Golden Age, when all of the land had become Christian and identified with the Judeo-Christian value system. So looking back, we know that they unified, but prior to that unification, it was a mismatched hodgepodge of special interests that were developing and warring with one another. While we have the record of Lehi's journey and the Mulekites who were bringing Hebrew values, the bulk of the genealogy and cultural baggage in the Maya region is most likely Minoan, Mycenaean, Phoenician, Southeast Asian, Egyptian, and Canaanite. Many of these are the cultural influences involved in the serpent migrations from the 15th century BC. These seafaring cultures and their market-centered mindsets are the primary industrial engine that fuels the motivation for social interactions. Does anybody recognize this?
Maslow's pyramid.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so you notice here down below, people are dealing in the concrete level of operation of social status, individual and social. And you know, you have to be able to breathe, you have to be able to find food and water and have a certain sense of personal safety. And then once you get from there, you build up into familial security of the body, of being able to continue in production that provides for the family and begin to interact with one another. And then you have the friendship and family, and these first three layers are what keeps a society together. It is the social trust that we have with one another, and it is in this particular layers that you have a cultural identity, right? And that's what is happening all throughout the Mesoamerican region. These people are all dealing on this level, and that is the foundation of their interaction with one another. The abstract, the aesthetics, the spiritual aspects is what the Book of Mormon gives us. It gives us the higher perspective of things that they consider, because of their Judeo-Hebrew background, these are the eternal aspects in their frame of mind. It has to do with being able to develop self-esteem and to have confidence and achievement, respect for one another, respected by others, and then you get into morality, creativity, spontaneity, lack of prejudice, acceptance of facts, and so on. But this is the aspect, and you can tell just by, you're getting fewer and fewer people in agreement as you move up on this. But this is the story that we're getting out of the Book of Mormon. All of these other things are going down, and we don't have a clue how that's taking place, except we're starting to find it now in the archaeology. And it is in the midst of these larger commercialization movements, which tend to foster human greed and avarice, that the gospel was introduced in an effort to create a more egalitarian society. Egalitarian meaning equalized. This is what I find one of the most impressive arguments for perspective in the Book of Mormon. It's Alma. Now the Zoramites had gathered themselves together in a land which they called Antionum, which was east of the land of Zarahemla, which lay nearly bordering upon the seashore, which was south of the land of Jershon, which also bordered upon the wilderness south, which wilderness was full of the Lamanites. Now the Nephites greatly feared that the Zoramites would enter into correspondence with the Lamanites, and that it would be the means of great loss on the parts of the Nephites. In other words, he could hear the war drums beating. He knew things were about ready to go bad. And now, as preaching of the word had had a greater tendency to lead the people to do that which was just, yea, it had had more powerful effect upon the minds of the people than the sword, or anything else which had happened unto them. Therefore, Alma thought it was expedient that they should try the virtue of the word of God. And then he and 7 others went into the Zoramites, and they preached and converted a bunch. And he went into a very stratified region. If you remember, the Zoramites were complaining they couldn't worship in the very temples that they had built because the clothing was too coarse. So they were the labor class, the worker class, and they weren't allowed to go in and worship in those buildings that they built. Remember that the Book of Mormon, remember what the Book of Mormon claims to be. It is a record of the spiritual history of the Nephites. Many times we are reminded that this is not even 100th part of the things which they experienced. Reports of their civic and commercial activities would not be included unless it directly impacted their spirituality. So we get those reports of, after 2 or 3 years, the people begin to be proud, and they begin to have status and all of this, and then it led to another war of some form. Additionally, we are told that the more complete story is found on the large plates of Nephi, that nothing of their civic or commercial records are included in Mormon's abridgment. So here are conclusions that can be made. Number one, there is clear evidence that the recorded events happening in the Americas seem to align with large events happening in the Mediterranean region. This means it is reasonable to believe that constant ancient American transoceanic contact was taking place in the form of trade. And we have clues of that in the dialogue of the Olmec or the Jaredite record. Number two, the Nephite record is faithful on two claims. A, it only reports on events impacting the Nephites. In other words, the only thing we know about the Mulekites or the Lamanites or the people of Bountiful or the Jaredites is where the Nephites interacted with them. And so I think Mormon and Moroni were very careful that they weren't going to try and report on someone else's historical story, only theirs. So you're getting purely a Nephite perspective. These are the things that happened, and this is how we interacted with them, and here is the result of those interactions. And B, it only reports the spiritual history and large cause and effect events. Number three, there is strong evidence of a seafaring culture that identifies as serpents. It begins with Minoans, but then is found in Mycenaean colonization and multiple other seafaring cultures that follow. More to come on this serpent connection in next week's presentation. So the previous conclusions account for the way the Book of Mormon reads. Reading it causes one to believe that the Jaredites, Nephites, and Mulekites are the only Middle East cultures who have traveled to the Americas. This is a fallacy, unintentionally created by the content choice of the authors. Because the metal plate media upon which the abridgment is written was restricted to one large ring-bound volume, the space was limited, and they had to set tight parameters on the subject matter of the story being told. It is so narrowly focused by design that we as readers are viewing the massive ancient historical landscape of the Americas through a tiny peephole and completely losing the advantage of total context. Therefore, our research process is similar to proving the theory of black holes in space, where the gravity of the object is so massive that even light cannot escape. The only way to determine that the massive gravity object exists is by observing how the smaller objects around it behave. We have to do the same with the events provided to us in the Book of Mormon. We take the scant recorded history that the Book of Mormon provides and then ask questions of what would cause those events to take place. Then match that up against other global events taking place at that time. Couple all of that with the local archaeological evidence, and a theory begins to develop. This is just one theory on explaining what is not expressly included in the Book of Mormon record, but what is clearly found in the archaeological record. Wow. So, taking from the inspired version of Genesis, "And great tribulation shall be among the children of men, but my people will I preserve, and righteousness will I send down out of heaven, and truth will I send forth out of the earth, to bear testimony of mine only begotten, his resurrection from the dead, yea, and also the resurrection of all men. And righteousness and truth will I cause to sweep the earth as with a flood, to gather out mine own elect from the four quarters of the earth unto a place which I shall prepare, a holy city, that my people may gird up their loins and be looking forth to the time of my coming. For there shall be my tabernacle, and it shall be called Zion, a new Jerusalem." My take on that. It appears that God intends for us to first express our faith in his Book of Mormon, which is righteousness out of heaven, and let the archaeological evidences, truth, coming forth out of the earth to provide the affirmation of our faith and in giving us clues for comprehending the broader context. Our next presentation will be an overview of all that we've presented, and in the process it will bring home the point about how the serpent is a cultural symbol for seafaring.